You are now watching Earth News Channel. You can change your world.
Hi, I'm David Chandler, and I've been very involved with the 9/11 Truth Movement for several years now. A few years ago, when I first heard the prospect that the buildings in New York City were brought down with explosives, I was initially quite skeptical of this because I didn't see any compelling reason to see why this had to be the case. But what I did in response to this idea is I started looking more carefully at the videos and to see what I could see. Like, is there evidence that where this is there a strong reason to believe that this is actually what happened? And I started just on a qualitative basis, just looking at things, and then little by little I got more into measurement, and I brought my physics background into this. I'm a physics teacher. I've taught college level and high school physics. And I bring that into my work, as you'll see as we go along. What I've done is I've posted short video clips on YouTube, and what we're going to do on this DVD is string these together with commentary and to try to give the bigger picture. The little clips, each one is like a single theme, but I'm going to try and weave them together. This first clip is called North Tower Exploding, and all it is an infinite loop just showing the North Tower coming down repeatedly. And in the process, I'll be narrating the things that I'm seeing. What you need to do is see what you're seeing, and use this just as an opportunity to open your eyes a little bit. The starting point in science is observation. What you are seeing here is what happened to the North Tower of the World Trade Center, the second of 3 buildings to collapse on 9/11/2001. I use the word collapse, but words can be deceptive. What do you really see happening here? There's a tremendous amount of falling debris, but under the canopy of debris, do you see the rapid sequence of explosive ejections of material? Some of the jets have been clocked at over 100 miles per hour. I will call them explosions because it's hard to find other words that describe what we are seeing here. The explosions are not isolated and few. They are continuous and widespread. They move progressively down the faces of the building, keeping pace with the falling debris. Perhaps you can imagine a natural cause, but I can't. Notice that the explosions are occurring on multiple floors at once, over a wide zone, not in a floor-by-floor sequence that might be explained by pancaking collapse. Notice there are explosions far below the point of collapse. Some are isolated and focused. These are often referred to as squibs and are commonly seen in controlled demolitions. However, this is not a standard controlled demolition. The building is being progressively destroyed from the top down by waves of explosions, creating a huge debris field. The destruction is in waves, not just in one wave. Most obvious is a rapid sequence of explosions near the visible corner of the building. But simultaneously we can see another wave of explosions much further down the face of the building under the canopy of falling debris. Notice that both waves of explosions progress down the face of the building, nearly keeping pace with the falling debris just a few feet away. Slabs of concrete did not fall to the ground and smash to dust. There is almost no concrete in the rubble pile. Notice that the concrete is being forcefully ejected outward from the sides of the building, already pulverized to dust. Notice that embedded in the dust clouds are huge girders and entire sections of steel framing that are being hurled out of the building. The horizontal speed of some of the girders has been clocked at over 70 miles per hour. Some of these girders impale themselves in the sides of neighboring buildings. Some landed as much as 2 football fields away from the base of the tower. What could hurl heavy girders with such force and give them such speed? Some people have suggested that the weight of the tower crushing down on the girders caused them to flex, and they sprung sideways by a spring action. But we are not seeing isolated jumping girders. We are seeing a major fraction of the mass of the building, steel, concrete, office furniture, and the remains of human beings, reduced to small pieces of rubble and fine dust, and being explosively ejected in all directions. Bone fragments are found on the roofs of adjacent buildings. The bones were not crushed in the falling mass, or they would have been trapped in the debris pile. They were pulverized along with everything else and blown out in all directions. The NIST investigators have claimed that the top section of the building above the plane impact point came down like a pile driver, crushing the undamaged lower section of the building all the way to the ground. The top section of the building is, however, noticeably absent. There is nothing above the ring of explosions except for a fountain of debris. Can you see a pile driver? It does not appear that the building is being crushed by anything. The waves of destruction and explosive ejections of material are occurring over a wide zone that continues all the way to the top of what remains of the building. The scientists at NIST did not model the collapse of the towers. Their analysis was gravely flawed in many ways, but the biggest flaw was that the scope of their investigation was artificially limited. They took their analysis only to the point of initiation of collapse, as though all that followed was inevitable and needed no explanation. The scope of their investigation was artificially limited to what might have happened or could have happened to begin the collapse. What they explicitly did not take into account is what actually happened. By limiting their investigation to the natural precursors of collapse, plane damage and the fire, they ruled out from the start any possibility of discovering evidence of planned demolition. In other words, anything that occurred during the collapse itself, such as the evidence you're seeing here, was explicitly scripted out of the investigation. Any analytical model of the collapse, no matter how simple or how sophisticated, is a bad model and bad science if it does not come back full circle to explain the actual observations. What do you see?
That first video that we looked at was Building 1 of the World Trade Center complex, also known as the North Tower. It's identifiable as the one that has the antenna on top of the roof. Building 2 looked very much alike, except it didn't have the antenna. And there was a third building that completely and totally was demolished on September 11th, which is Building 7. This was there were 7 buildings in the World Trade Center complex. And all the buildings were demolished to one extent or another, but buildings 1, 2, and 7 were completely demolished into disassociated materials that landed. Well, in the case of buildings 1 and 2, it was spread all over the place. But in the case of building 7, it was a nice, tidy pile right in its own footprint. This building it would basically cover a football field. It's 100 meters wide, and it's 47 stories tall. So it's close to half the height of the World Trade Center towers. And it was a huge building. It was not hit by an aircraft. And it dropped at 5:20 in the evening. And it just was a sudden onset. And it was a very unusual collapse. People who look at this building for the first time, frequently this is all it takes to realize something very fishy is going on here. It looks like a controlled demolition. So what I'm doing in this next video is taking measurements of the roof line as it comes down. I had heard various people say that the building was coming down close to free fall. I wanted to get the measurement myself. I teach physics, and one of the tools I use in the classroom is an analysis tool that enables you to take a video clip and you can put markers on each frame. And then as long as you have something in the picture that you know the size, so you can calibrate the measurement, you can actually get the data from the little marks you put on it and use this to calculate things like velocities and accelerations and so forth. So this was one of the key measurements I did fairly early on. And in fact, the one I'm going to show you, it says it's a revised version. I did an earlier version before this one. This particular video was made in August of 2008, at the time that NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, released their Building 7 analysis, and it gave data in there that allowed me to get a good calibration. And so this is the result of that measurement.
This is a revised analysis of the downward acceleration of the World Trade Center Building 7, which collapsed in a manner suggestive of controlled demolition on September 11, 2001. My earlier analysis, which is posted on YouTube under my own name, was based on the best information I had at the time, but I now have been able to improve on my results using new information available in the recently released NIST final report on Building 7. Despite the accurate data available to NIST, their final report makes dishonest claims about the rate of fall of the building. I'll come back to the NIST report at the end of this video. In my earlier video analysis, I used the width of the building, which is known to be 100 meters, to calibrate the scale of the image. In this remake, I've used the vertical spacing of the windows visible as horizontal streaks on the face of the building. From this, I was able to identify the 29th floor, which is listed in the NIST document as having a height of 683 feet 6 inches, measuring from some baseline which they don't specify. They have the blueprints, I don't, but I take this measurement to be reliable. The other measurement they give is the height of the roof line, which they state is 925 feet 4 inches above their baseline. The difference of these two heights converted to meters is the basis for the calibration of this video. The actual measurements were done exactly as before. The cursor was placed on the corner of the building and marks were placed frame by frame. The built-in functions of the Physics Toolkit software capture the positions and times of these marks in a data table from which it computes and displays various kinds of graphs. I'm here plotting velocity as a function of time. The slope of this kind of graph gives the acceleration. Notice that the data hovers close to 0 for nearly a second, and then it drops precipitously. From the moment of the drop, the slope of the line appears essentially constant for about 2.5 seconds. By marking two data points, the program can compute the best straight line to fit the data for the linear portion of the graph. The slope of the line is the acceleration. Down here at the bottom, the computed acceleration is shown, minus 9.885 meters per second squared. The minus sign indicates downward acceleration. The acceleration of gravity for New York City is 9.802 meters per second squared, so the measured acceleration is within 1% of the acceleration of gravity. Given the graininess and size of the image, 1% is not a significant difference from the actual acceleration of gravity. So the most accurate way to characterize the result is to say the acceleration of the building is indistinguishable from freefall. Notice that a little after the 3-second mark on our graph, about 2.5 seconds after the building drops, the acceleration ceases to be uniform. This indicates that the falling building is starting to encounter more resistance. Any measurement of the average acceleration that continues for more than the first 2.5 seconds of fall will show a lower average acceleration, masking the fact that for a significant 2.5 seconds, the building was in literal freefall. Freefall can only be achieved if there is zero resistance to the motion. In other words, the gravitational potential energy of the building is not available to crush or deform anything. During freefall, all of the gravitational potential energy of the building is being converted into kinetic energy and nothing else. Any breaking, bending, crushing, or pulverizing of the building components is occurring without the assistance of the free-falling portion of the building. Any force the top portion of the building might exert on the lower portion would be reflected in a reaction force that would produce an observable slowing of the rate of fall. A reaction force is observable in this graph only in the last seconds when the velocity strays from the straight line. Let's return to the NIST final report on WTC-7. I would like to clarify one thing right away. On page 40 there is a phrase, quote, assuming that the descent speed was approximately constant, unquote. The assumption is clearly false from even casual observation. However, the fact that they proceed to use a formula for constant acceleration clearly indicates the constant speed reference is a misstatement. They're actually assuming constant acceleration. More bizarre is the claim that, quote, the actual time for the upper 18 stories to collapse, based on video evidence, was approximately 40% longer than the computed freefall time. If you start with a 40% increase in the time of fall and work backwards to compute the effective acceleration, Their claim is equivalent to saying the acceleration of the building is only 5 meters per second squared, which is 51% the acceleration of gravity. Our results, however, clearly show a significant stretch of time in which the acceleration of the building is indistinguishable from the acceleration of gravity itself. In other words, complete freefall. They did not use a method that sampled a position versus time to show the velocity profile, as was done here. The NIST report uses only 2 data points: the supposed start of the collapse and the time the roofline disappears from view. By choosing an early starting time several seconds prior to the onset of freefall and computing only the average acceleration between that point and the disappearance of the roofline, they gloss over everything that happened in between. I'm sure they detected some movement of the roofline at the point where they started the clock as a rationale for choosing that point. Even our data here shows a tiny amount of motion in the first second. But what was going on during this time is qualitatively different from what happened moments later. The event triggering the start of their measurement could more accurately be described as precursor movement. This is like timing the acceleration of a car in a drag race, where the starting light goes on, then the driver revs his engine a few times before letting out the clutch. It may be a fair way to penalize a sloppy driver, but it doesn't say anything about the acceleration of the car once it is actually moving. This method tells us nothing about the nature of the motion itself. They merely assume uniform acceleration over a time interval in which it is clear that the acceleration is not uniform. Mislabeling their assumption to be constant speed indicates sloppy work, but asserting uniform acceleration for an interval where the building sits nearly motionless for several seconds, then drops for several seconds in freefall, is beyond incompetence. It is a crude, blatant lie. The average acceleration is a meaningless quantity. It is the instantaneous acceleration that is significant, because the acceleration at any moment is an indication of the forces at work. To measure and publish a meaningless average acceleration, when sufficient data and a multi-million-dollar budget are available to measure the actual velocity profile, constitutes either gross incompetence or an attempt to obfuscate the issue. This is high school physics we're talking about. If they can't get the high school physics right, what confidence can we have in their multicolored, computer-animated whiz-bang simulations that tell us the exact sequence of girder failures without any physical evidence for any of it? I'm a high school teacher. I teach my students better lab practice than this demonstrates here. In this video, I have measured the velocity profile and the instantaneous acceleration of the building with orders of magnitude better precision than NIST, and I did it with zero budget, a free software tool commonly used in high school physics classes, and a copy of a video downloaded from the internet. I know the guys at NIST are not incompetent. What I'm left to conclude is that their only purpose in even mentioning freefall is to muddy the water and derail the discussion. The rate of fall of the building is an embarrassment to the official theory. Freefall is a small detail in the whole complex analysis, but it is not a minor issue. Buildings cannot fall at freefall through themselves, because even a weakened building requires energy to break up the pieces, crush the concrete, and push things around. When the falling building pushes things, the fall is not free. The things push back, and the reaction forces will measurably slow the descent of the building. This is why one would reasonably expect crumbling structures to come down in a tumbling, halting, irregular manner. In short, the evidence is clear. We are witnessing not the collapse of a building, but its demolition. And we have received not a report from an independent scientific investigation, but a cover-up by a government agency.
It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
When NIST released their report on Building 7 in August of 2008, one of the things they did was to have a technical briefing. And at first I thought, well, no way am I going to be accepted to ask questions at this briefing, because it was limited to engineers or scientists with institutional affiliations of some kind. But I went ahead and applied anyway. And guess what? I was given a password and just 5 minutes before the briefing started, I was enabled to submit a question, which I did. So this video, this upcoming here, shows a little bit of what happened at that briefing.
In August 2008, after a 7-year delay, NIST, the government agency charged with investigating the World Trade Center collapses, released the draft of their final report on the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 for public comment. In that report, they claimed that the time for the building to fall the first 18 stories, that's the part of the collapse visible on many videos, was 40% longer than it would have taken had it been in free fall. I responded with a video posted on YouTube called WTC7 in Freefall, in which I showed that for approximately 2.5 seconds, Building 7 fell at a rate indistinguishable from freefall. Furthermore, in that video I showed that NIST's methodology was not a valid way to analyze the true motion of the building. NIST's measurement was not just wrong, it was fraudulent. Then on August 26th, NIST staged a technical briefing in which engineers and others with technical credentials could pose questions. I'm a high school physics teacher, so I figured I would be excluded. However, I went ahead and registered, citing my membership in the American Association of Physics Teachers as my professional affiliation. By the way, I am not speaking for AAPT. That was just my passport into the briefing. To my surprise, my credentials were accepted and I was able to pose a question. Here's a little of how it went.
Our next question comes from David Chandler of the American Association of Physics Teachers. Any number of competent measurements using a variety of methods indicate the northwest corner of WTC7 fell with an acceleration within a few percent of the acceleration of gravity. Yet your report contradicts this, claiming 40% slower than free fall based on a single data point. How can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside?
Well, first of all, gravity is the loading function that applies to the structure, applies to every body, all bodies on this particular on this planet, not just in ground zero.
Whoa! I'm used to responses like that on a physics exam when a student hasn't even bothered to open the book. But this is NIST speaking, so let's continue.
The analysis showed there's a difference in time between a free fall time. A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. And if you look at the analysis of the video, it shows that the time it takes for the 17 for the roof line of the video to collapse down the 17 floors that you can actually see in the video, below which you can't see anything in the video, is about 3.9 seconds. What the analysis shows, and the structural analysis shows, or the collapse analysis shows, it's that same time that it took for the structural model to come down from the roof line all the way for those 17 floors to disappear is 5.4 seconds. It's about 1.5 seconds, or roughly 40% more time for that free fall to happen. And that is not at all unusual, because there was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case, and you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place, and where everything was not instantaneous.
Buried in all that verbiage, what Dr. Sundar is saying is, free fall for the 18 stories under consideration would have taken 3.9 seconds. However, their computer model simulating collapse required 5.4 seconds. The slower collapse time was to be expected, since there was structure supporting the building as it fell, slowing the fall, that there was a progression of failures that had to take place, and that these were not instantaneous. All of this makes sense as long as you don't look at the evidence. The evidence shows that free fall actually occurred, but since their computer modeling could not come up with a scenario that would allow for free fall, they had to declare free fall out of bounds and try to cover up the evidence. The problem is, unlike the columns and girders buried deep inside the building, the motion of the building is right out in plain view. Since their model predicted 5.4 seconds for the 18-story collapse, they dutifully conjured up a 5.4 second measurement to match. They had to stretch themselves to do it, but they did it. They found the disappearance time, then they went out of their way to pick an artificially early start time, exactly 5.4 seconds earlier. This they compared with freefall time.
This next question comes from Dr. Stephen Jones. NIST discusses the fall time for WTC-7 on page 40 of the summary report, where it's stated, assuming that the descent speed was approximately constant. However, observations by others of the descent speed show that the building is accelerating rather than being at constant speed. So the question is, why did NIST assume that the descent speed was approximately constant?
Stephen Jones was calling attention to the obviously erroneous claim on page 40 of the draft report that stated that the building descended at constant speed. I'm sure constant speed was a simple misstatement. The correct response should have been, whoops, we'll fix that. But no, here's how they handled that question.
Force of gravity obviously is, the acceleration of gravity is what's at the driving force, and our calculation was based on the amount of time from the top of the parapet to fall till it disappeared from view between the two buildings seen in the video. That time was established from the video by single frame search of the time, so that was down to 1/30th of a second, and then we did the same thing for when the top of the parapet disappeared. We found that time to be 5.4 seconds.
I didn't hear a whoops in there, did you? This is John Gross, one of the lead engineers for the NIST report on the collapse of the Twin Towers. He has a PhD in structural engineering from Cornell University. He taught engineering at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He has a long resume on top of that. Don't you think he probably knows the difference between speed and acceleration? Don't you think he could explain it with perfect clarity if he wasn't so preoccupied trying to cover his tracks? Don't you find it interesting that the 5.4 seconds he measured for the collapse time just happens to exactly match the theoretical prediction of their model? That kind of precision is incredibly rare when modeling real-world events. Incredible is the right word. It's not credible. This measurement has all the characteristics of what we call dry labbing, manipulating the data to fit a predetermined outcome. It's an ethics violation in science on a par with plagiarism. Any engineers engaging in this kind of sleight of hand should lose their licenses. The larger implication, of course, is dry labbing in this kind of investigation would constitute a criminal cover-up. After another round of quibbling, someone had to step in and bail out poor John.
Can you clarify that?
I think it's something that we need to clarify and correct in the final version of the report.
Okay.
That was August. This is November. The final version of the NIST WTC-7 report just came out, and guess what? We have a revised analysis of the building collapse rate. Constant speed is out. Constant acceleration is out. Instead, we have 3 phases of collapse, with a whopping 2.25 seconds of absolute freefall. The irrelevant 5.4 seconds is still defended in the wording, but it plays no apparent role other than CYA for John Gross and Associates. So freefall is hereby official dogma. How are they going to handle all the ramifications of that inconvenient fact? Read on. It says, the 3 stages of collapse progression described above are consistent with the results of the global collapse analysis discussed in Chapter 12 of NIST's NC Star 1-9. That's it. Freefall went from an impossibility that required backflips in logic to obfuscate, to a simple fact to be measured, then declared consistent with their fire-induced collapse hypothesis. Apparently they have now decided that freefall is okay as long as it is seen as a part of a longer stretch of time that covers the required 5.4 seconds. In other words, they dropped the bullying tactic of blowing smoke to obscure the facts, and adopted an alternate bullying tactic, cover it with a lie, and walk away. However, NIST cannot walk away from freefall. Now that NIST has certified freefall as fact, take a look at the implications.
For those of you who don't have a lot of physics background, one of the concepts that might be a little bit tricky to understand is the difference between constant speed and constant acceleration. So I'd like to elaborate on that just a little bit here. Constant speed is if you look at the speedometer on your car and it's holding steady. So if you're going down the freeway at 60 miles an hour, that's constant speed. If you're going down at 30 miles an hour, that's a constant speed. It's a slower constant speed. Okay. But if you're at a stop sign and then you start up, the speedometer is going to be increasing. And so as the speedometer needle goes up, if it goes up at a uniform rate, you're picking up speed, and as time goes on, you're picking up more speed. And as you're picking up more and more speed, and if you do that at a uniform rate, that's constant acceleration. In the case of gravity, if I drop something, it's accelerating. The thing that you drop is going to accelerate because it starts off at rest, and then as time goes by, it's going to pick up equal increments of speed in equal amounts of time. So in the first second it picks up a little speed, and the next second it picks up another equal amount of speed, and so forth. And that's what we mean by acceleration. So acceleration is the rate of change of speed, just like speed is the rate of change of position. So these are related quantities, but they're very distinctly different. Interesting to note that even NIST had some trouble with that concept, so don't feel bad. I was originally going to make a two-part series on the NIST tech briefing because there are so many implications of their admission of freefall. However, I got sidetracked in the process of making part two, and I was curious to know how did NIST go about doing their measurement. Like they got an erroneous measurement from which they could claim that it took 40% longer than freefall, even though it's obvious just by looking at it that it's close to freefall, and with a measurement you can see it's pretty much right at freefall. So how did they do this? I'm just going to let this video speak for itself. This is how I tracked down the way NIST did that measurement.
Part 2 of this series was going to be an exploration of the significance of NIST's admission that World Trade Center Building 7 underwent a period of freefall acceleration. That'll have to wait for Part 3. After suggesting in Part 1 of this video that John Gross's method for determining the time of fall might constitute dry labbing, in other words, falsifying measurements to support a predetermined outcome, I got curious to know exactly what event he picked to start the clock. The measurement is a little tedious, but the result is very significant. That's often the way it is in science, so stay with me on this one. Let's start with John Gross's explanation of how he determined the time of fall. By the way, you might recall this was not the question he was asked, but it is the answer he gave.
Our calculation was based on the amount of time from the top of the parapet to fall till it disappeared from view between the two buildings seen in the video. That time was established from the video by a single frame search of the time, so that was down to 1/30th of a second, and then we did the same thing for when the top of the parapet disappeared. We found that that time to be 5.4 seconds.
To identify the point he picked as the start of collapse, we have to work backward. The ending point of his measurement was when the roof line came down to the level of the 29th floor. In our video, there's a structure on the roof of a foreground building that lines up with the 29th floor of Building 7, so it's easy to identify. I imported the video into a measurement program called VideoPoint, which has a frame counter, and stepped forward to the frame where the roof line lines up with the foreground marker. That's frame 178, counting from the first frame of the video clip I'm using. At 30 frames per second, 5.4 seconds comes out to be 162 frames. Subtracting this from frame 178 brings us to frame 16. So let's go back and see what's happening at or about frame 16. I put a red mark on frame 16, so as it goes by, you'll recognize it. Let's go back to the beginning and step through this section of the video. Watch for the beginning of the collapse. This is frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. We're up to frame 30. Did you see the collapse begin? I didn't. Try rewinding the video a few times. It's pretty boring. There's not the slightest hint of any collapse until frame 40. 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. There's a tiny motion of the corner of the west penthouse at frame 40. Then there is no more motion until about frame 46. Note that the motion of the penthouse precedes the movement of the roofline. There is no measurable movement of the roofline until frame 46. That's a full second beyond frame 16. Even then, there isn't any progressive ongoing movement of the roofline until about frame 60. By then we're back to just over 3.9 seconds of collapse time, or in other words, the onset of freefall. The only rationale I can see for choosing frame 16 to start the clock is to make the measurement come out to exactly 5.4 seconds, to agree with the prediction of NIST's collapse model. But what if I'm wrong? What if they did see some tiny movement on a clearer version of the video? That tiny movement, whatever it might have been, did not last. It would have had to have been a glitch, and the scientists at NIST would recognize it as a glitch, because there's no measurable difference in the height of the roofline for the next 20 to 30 frames. What can we conclude? You can draw your own conclusions, but I think it's pretty clear that the whole idea there is any kind of real 5.4 second collapse interval is a fiction. It's a crude fabrication, and the three-stage collapse sequence is pseudoscience in the service of an ongoing cover-up. In Part 3, we will return to the central question. In conceding freefall, what has NIST actually admitted?
The measurement I did in Part 2 of this video is how I actually determined when the start time was. However, it's not very graphically appealing. What I did later was I added a clock to the video sequence. I actually selected out just those 5.4 seconds by themselves, and I did a separate run just so that you can actually see what this timing really looked like. So let's watch that now.
In Part 2 of the video series, WTC7, NIST finally admits freefall. I look at NIST's claim that Building 7 took 5.4 seconds for the top of the roofline to descend to the level of the 29th floor. I wanted to address the question, what was going on when the NIST team started their clock? The answer? Not much. The video I created at the time showed my actual process of discovery. I stepped through the video and counted frames. I have since created a more graphic illustration of the famous 5.4 second interval. This time I have added a clock to the frames. Each full cycle marks 1 second. Here is the 5.4 second interval. Here it is again in slow motion. Notice that the building doesn't start falling right away. The flagrance of the deceit is most apparent when the video is run backward in slow motion. See if you can anticipate when the clock should have started for a fair timing. How about now? Maybe now. No, the clock was started a second and a half before the corner of the building started to move, and about a second prior to any noticeable movement of the penthouse. There is nothing subtle here. This is the measurement NIST used to compare to claims that the building came down at free fall. Whatever they might claim was happening at their starting point, it had nothing to do with the rate of fall of the building.
Okay, part 3 of this series actually is what I was intending to do as part 2. This is going to spell out the implications of NIST's admission that Building 7 went through a period of free fall.
Shyam Sunder is the lead investigator for the NIST analysis of the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. In the technical briefing on August 26th, Dr. Sunder clearly explained why free fall for World Trade Center 7 was impossible.
The analysis showed there's a difference in time between a free fall time. A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. And that is not at all unusual because there was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case. And you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place, and where everything was not instantaneous.
This brings us to their computer model. NIST's so-called investigation actually consists of finding a way to reproduce the mysterious collapse of the building using a computer model. The assumption is that if the computer model can be made to reproduce the observed collapse pattern, that must be how it happened. The problem is, if something unexpected was going on, like explosives for instance, you're not going to discover it in the computer model. For that, you need to look at the actual evidence. So why not examine the steel directly? Oh yes, there isn't any. At least there isn't any after it was hauled away to Asia and melted down. NIST's investigation has been compared to conducting an autopsy without the corpse. As of 2005, NIST reported having only 236 pieces of steel from the World Trade Center complex, none of them unambiguously identified as being from World Trade Center 7. We've all watched CSI. Anyone serious about solving a crime knows the importance of physical evidence. Yet here the crime scene was scrubbed, the evidence was destroyed, and the investigation was delayed for years. Destroying a crime scene is itself a criminal act. Destroying the steel has absolutely no justification except to cover up the cause of the collapse. So even if we knew nothing else about the events of that day, we can see immediately there was a cover-up. Knowing there was a cover-up is a strong indication there was a crime someone wanted covered up. Any investigation that does not acknowledge this basic fact is not really an investigation. It's an extension of the cover-up. NIST claims their computer model can account for the observed phenomena. So let's look at NIST's model. Except we can't. The software they use to do the modeling is available, but their model actually consists of all the numbers and measurements and assumptions together with any tweaks to the system they might have used to get it to come out the way they wanted. If that information were released, their results could be checked by anyone with the appropriate skills and software tools. But NIST has not released the numbers. All we've been shown are some of the selected animated outputs they were able to get their model to produce. Is their model realistic? We don't know. Some models are chaotic in the mathematical sense. In other words, tiny variations in the inputs might result in wildly different outcomes. Is NIST's model stable or chaotic? Realistic or contrived? Honest or fraudulent? We don't know. We can't know without independent testing. The very process of running the model until it produces the kind of result you're looking for is called selection bias. If you think about it, NIST's methodology is explicitly based on selection bias. Even if you could show what might have happened, it doesn't show what actually did happen. The very fact that NIST has not released their model strongly suggests they don't want their results checked. In other words, their results are intended to be taken strictly on faith. If NIST has not released their modeling data and their assumptions, they have really not released their report. And the fact that this is their final report indicates they do not intend to do so. Therefore, on the face of it, their report is little more than a fancy, expensive cover-up. One fact we do know about NIST's model is it does not allow for freefall. The best they could do is 5.4 seconds for the building to crumple down through 18 floors. Crumpling absorbs energy, and that makes freefall impossible. There's nothing in the models we have been shown that even resemble a three-stage collapse with a free-fall component. After all, as Shyam Sunder put it himself, free fall happens only when there are no structural components below the falling section of the building. Any natural scenario is going to involve a progression of failures, and these don't happen instantaneously. So, in the end, we come back to where we were in the beginning. On first impression, we were looking at a classic controlled demolition. NIST claimed to have found a way it could have happened naturally, but in fact they failed. The only way they can support their claim is through lies, secrecy, and pompous but false pronouncements. That constitutes a failed agenda. Explosive demolition is the only scenario that has been put forward that could actually account for the observations. Where does that leave us? We have a building that underwent directly observable and now officially acknowledged freefall, with no plausible mechanisms other than explosive demolition. We have an official investigation by a government agency that has fraudulently manipulated data, that has refused to even consider existing physical evidence that explosives were used. They have wrapped themselves and their data in secrecy and offered up pronouncements as conclusions to be taken on faith. The NIST investigation is a fraud and a farce. We need a new, fully empowered, truly independent, and open investigation. We are told that the twin towers at the World Trade Center were weakened by airplane impacts and fire, then came down in a gravity-driven collapse. Just look at the supposed collapses. It stretches credibility to even call them collapses. These events resemble explosions, even eruptions, more than collapses. We are not seeing the walls come a-tumbling down, with the dust blown out to the side. We are seeing massive projectiles thrown horizontally hundreds of feet. By massive, I mean multiple tons. A single perimeter wall unit consisting of 3 14-inch square columns, 36 feet long, connected by spandrels, weighed on the order of 4 tons. Some of these are seen flying outside the debris cloud, reaching farther than the majority of the debris. My very first personal investigation of the 9/11 events was when I watched the expanding debris cloud from the North Tower on a DVD several years ago. I paused the DVD, took out a ruler, and estimated the horizontal velocity of one of the debris streamers right on the television screen. My rough estimate was about 60 miles per hour. With that measurement, I was hooked. I realized something very strange was going on. I followed up with digital measurements on videos downloaded from the internet, using a tool I had available at the time, Physics Toolkit. Some of my early measurements, using low-resolution videos, were crude. Over time, I have gained access to higher quality videos and better measurement tools, so I decided to go back and redo my early measurements of projectile speeds. First, I looked at the westward moving projectile from the North Tower that I had crudely measured on the television screen a few years ago. This time, I got a reliable value of 25 meters per second, which translates to about 56 miles per hour. My original estimate was pretty close. On a video of the South Tower, I noticed a large, elongated object moving like a javelin above the main debris cloud. On the original video where I saw this object, the camera was zooming the whole time, which made the measurement difficult. I recently found another video which shows the same projectile, but taken with a stationary camera. Result, 20 meters per second, or 45 miles per hour. Another high-speed projectile was launched northward from the North Tower, late in the collapse, toward Building 7. Close-ups show the structure of the object, which appears to be one or more wall units. This particular video footage was shot by Rick Siegel from across the Hudson River. He panned the camera a lot, so the measurement was a challenge, but I decomposed the video into individual images and manually aligned the images to stabilize the video. I used the stabilized video to do the measurements and got good uniform results, 35 meters per second or 78 miles per hour. I've repeated this measurement with other techniques and have consistently gotten results well over 70 miles per hour. High-speed, massive horizontal projectiles may not be smoking gun evidence all by itself, but it is very suggestive of an explosive event. It's another piece of the puzzle.
Building 7, as I measured, as we talked about already, came down at free fall. In other words, at the acceleration of gravity. When I started measuring the North Tower came straight down, or pretty much straight down, and so it's easy to measure it as well. When I measured the roof line of the North Tower, it did not come down at free fall. It came down close to 2/3. I think it's 64% of free fall. But in any case, once I did the measurement, my first reaction was, oh well, it's not free fall, and I set it aside. But I came back to it later and I asked myself the question, how much kind of force is needed to slow it down so that it's accelerating downward but at less than gravity? And so I did the analysis using standard techniques that I do for, when anybody sets up a physics problem. It's like taking the body that you're looking at and isolating it from its surroundings and apply all the forces to this thing called a free body diagram. And once I did that, I came up with a surprising result. I wasn't anticipating this, but it actually is a very solid proof that the top section of this building was not what was causing the bottom section to collapse. So let's watch the video and I'll have more to say afterwards.
This is the start of the collapse of World Trade Center number 1, also known as the North Tower. We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building. This may seem counterintuitive to you. You might think a falling block coming down on the lower section of the building would exert a greater force than a stationary block. But that is true only if the falling block actually impacts the lower block, which would cause the falling block to decelerate. The only way the falling block can continue to accelerate smoothly, as we see here, is for the lower section of the building to give way without significant resistance. If this rate of acceleration continued all the way to the ground, the building would fall in about 11.5 seconds. This is close to the observed collapse time. So far I've been using the term block loosely. What we actually see here is the falling section of the building turning to dust before our eyes. But what is happening to the upper section of the building behind the dust clouds doesn't really affect this analysis. Given the fact that it is accelerating downward, the top section of the building, whatever its condition, cannot possibly be destroying the lower section of the building. The destruction of the building must be caused by something else.
This DVD has focused very much on the physics of 9/11, and basically it's a personal statement on my part. This is the angle I come at it because this is who I am and this is what I know. And one of the things that amazes me is how I, as simply a high school teacher, have enough, if I actually apply what I know, there's so many things that are so clear about what's happening. There's so many people out there I've talked to that are much more knowledgeable about science even than I am. And the typical result is they've never even heard that Building 7 came down. They've never bothered to look at the evidence. And it's like there's a very strong stigma that has officially been placed on this to call it conspiracy theory and to try to stigmatize any interest in these events. 9/11 really is an event that changed the world, and it's changed everything since then. It hasn't changed our fundamental values, but it's changed the way our government interacts with the people. We have the ongoing wars of 9/11, as some people have put it. And as long as those wars are continuing to be fought, we can't just let 9/11 get swept under the rug, because this is where these things come from. We've killed over 1 million people in Iraq. That's a statistic that the papers don't tell you, but it's been researched multiple times by reliable institutions. We have killed over 1 million people in Iraq. It's not just that they have killed each other. This is an atrocity on a huge scale, and this is something that we cannot just let go. There's so many angles to this. I've come at it from the point of view of science. There's the political science, there's the sociology, there's the question of how come official science, like the people involved with NIST, have been manipulated the way they have to take good scientists with integrity and be able to use their talents and stamp it with a political agenda. And how people can allow this to happen with their life's work. Who am I speaking to? I'm speaking to the general public, whoever has enough interest in these events to have watched this video through. But I'm also speaking to people that have backgrounds in science, that if you actually look and ask the questions, the kinds of things I've done, or if you have expertise in other areas, look into this from your own particular perspective. I specifically am encouraging people who are involved in official authoritative science, such as NIST, to evaluate your life's work. Daniel Ellsberg is an example of someone who found it necessary to step outside the norms of what was expected of him in order to have a life that he could live with himself. And I really am hoping that some of you who are perhaps watching this video, if you have knowledge of what really happened, that you will make yourselves known and share this with the world. This is something that has not been resolved. Yes, it's a few years ago, but the wars of 9/11 are continuing, and it can't just be swept under the rug. It's too important for that. We need 9/11 truth.
You're watching the Earth News Channel. You can change your world.